spend time just reflecting on the passage and reflecting on what God is saying to you through the passage of Scripture. We're coming to Luke chapter 10 this morning, verses 38 through to 42. It's a familiar story. It's the story of Mary and Martha and Jesus and his disciples who went and visited with Mary and Martha. And then I'm going to introduce to you our guest speaker this morning. So reading from verse 38, Luke chapter 10. It says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made, and she came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. May God help us to understand and apply his word this morning. And invite Jason, would you come forward? Thank you. Jason Perkins is been a pastor. He's done a whole bunch of things from what I read in the bio, and he'll probably fill you in on some things. But he's here this morning because of the emotionally healthy spirituality courses that we've been running. And Jason and his family have joined us from down in North Lakes area. They've come up this morning. It's great to have you with us. And he is a part of the emotionally healthy spirituality team here in this region, and I think maybe in the Pacific kind of region as well. Had a lot of other experience in a bunch of other things, but Jason is going to share with us from God's Word this morning, and we welcome you to our service this morning.
Gary, thanks so much for having us. I've heard so much about this church for at least the last, I would say, 3 years or so, and it's mostly because my beautiful daughter, Olivia, who is with us this morning, married a guy from this church just over a year ago. They're celebrating their 1-year anniversary. And normally, you can give them a big round of applause. Normally when I travel and speak, I oftentimes will show a photo of our family. And I introduce Jack. For those of you that don't realize, Olivia married Jack Hodgson. I introduce Jack, and I tell this famous story about Jack being a finalist on Australian Ninja Warrior. And then I also mentioned that Jack and I have very similar physiques. Like when we go to the beach, I take my shirt off. Actually, I normally say, when Jack takes his shirt off at the beach, I always ask Kristen, I wonder what Olivia saw in Jack that was so attractive to him. So we are thrilled to be here after years of being aware of your church and just hearing the great things that God is doing in amongst the community here. We're just super stoked to be here this morning. As Gary said, my name's Jason. My last name is Perkins, and so most people refer to me as Perko. When I travel the world and I explain that to people, I have to go on to explain to them that us Aussies, we love to butcher the English language, and so we take any word that's too long and we cut it in half and we add an O or a Y onto the end of it. Fortunately for me, they added an O, because you can imagine middle school with the name Perky would have been really interesting. Would have been a really interesting season of my life. And then I do have some people that they actually think my name is Perko, not Jason. And I always think to myself, what kind of a parent would name their child Perko Perkins? Like, did they not see that that's a nickname somehow, some way? So anyway, that's a little bit about us. I'm going to share a bit more about us in a moment, but I do need to just fill you in. There may be like a speech pathologist or somebody in the room today, and you're going to be wondering, like, can I fix that guy somehow by the end of today's talk? I'm a dual citizen. My mum and dad are from the U.S. I was born here in Australia, and then my wife, who is originally from the U.S., moved to Australia when she was 15. It took me about 10 years to convince her I wasn't a punk teenager and could be someone that she could spend her whole life with. It took me a decade to convince her of that. We finally got married. We've actually been married. We just celebrated our 25th anniversary last December. And so we've been married for 25 years. But we've also lived in the U.S. For some extended periods of time. So my accent is like all over the place. It's really a hard one to nail down. My wife says I have the Russell Crowe version of the Australian accent. I've just been in the States far too long. But if you're trying to figure all of that out, that's part of our story, as we've lived in both countries for quite a bit of time. And so because of that, we actually travel quite a bit. And so I'd love to start off today by playing a little bit of a game before we dive into the story of Mary and Martha this morning. I'm actually a PE teacher by profession. So I have a 4-year degree in whistleblowing, and I'm really good at it. I'm really good, although I didn't bring a whistle this morning. So here's what I'd love to do, though. To play this game, it's really simple. You can just stay seated. I'd love for you just to raise your hand if you've ever been on a plane before. In fact, we're going to bring the question up on the screen here. Raise your hand if you've ever been on an airplane before. Okay, so most people in the room. I was going to give away a box of chocolates. I have these Cadbury favorites to anybody that had never been on a plane before this morning. But as I was sitting listening this morning, I thought to myself of Nathan, actually. And it's Nathan, right? And you've got, I think it's like 7 girls. Is that correct? 5 girls. Okay, so just 6. Okay, good news. Good news is the guest speaker, who's clueless, didn't get the number right, but neither did the father either. So that's really good. Nathan, I only have one daughter, and I know how expensive it was to marry her off. When I numbered your daughters, my heart went out to you, and so I want to give you this box of favorites this morning. And congratulations, by the way, on your latest. You're going to need a lot more than a box of chocolates, my friend. I'll be praying for you. Hey, so most people in the room, it sounds like you've been on an airplane before. So here's what I'd love to ask you is this question. And you can answer the question just with your fingers by putting up the amount of fingers that are relevant to the answer to the question, okay? So the question is this. What do you think is the most asked question by passengers on a plane? I travel a lot, I fly a lot, and so I've actually done my own research. This is not ChatGPT about to tell you the answer to this. This is actual research of me asking flight attendants on planes, hey, what's the most annoying question you get asked by passengers? And they tell me. And so if you think you know the answer, I want you to hold up with your fingers the answer to the question, all right? We got some people. Nathan's quick to the punch. He wasn't sure about how many children he had, but he knows how many. He thinks, okay, 4. We got a lot of 4s, quite a few 4s. Anybody else? Anybody else? Anybody just refuse to raise their hand in church altogether? Is there anyone? There's one up the back that missed the question, okay? All right, anybody with a 3 or a 2? So we got the answer to the questions like, where are we flying over right now? Why is your seatbelt different to ours? Have you ever wondered that, by the way? I sometimes sit across from the flight attendant, and I've got this tiny little sash belt, and they've got this like 4-point harness going on. And I'm like, do you know something that we don't know? Like, should we be aware of something? Or maybe you thought it was number 3. Can you help me with my bag? I always love seeing people get on the plane, and I'm like, there is no way that's going to fit up there. You obviously don't fly very often. Okay, can I change my seat? How do I flush? That's a very important question. Do you have a SIM eject tool? Like, that was a thing. Now they have these eSIMs, so you don't have to do that as often. But the answer to the question is, and most of you got it, the answer is actually number 4. Can I change my seat? You can go to the next slide if you like. Number 4, can I change my seat, is actually the answer to the question. But when I get on a plane, I have a go-to question that I love to ask every single time I get on a plane. And it's this question right here. Are you coming or going? That's the question that I love to ask when I get onto a plane. Are you coming or going? And the reason I love asking that question is because it leads to me being able to ask more questions. The answer to that question oftentimes leads me to being able to say, oh, okay, so you're going somewhere, or perhaps you've been someplace and you're heading home, and so I get to ask more questions. So if, by the way, you see me on a plane and you prefer not to talk to people, go ahead and just plug your headphones in or whatever, because I'm that guy that asks a lot of questions on a plane. And then the question that I most often get asked on a plane is this question right here. What do you do? Anybody else been asked that question before? Maybe not even on a plane. Has anybody been asked the question like, hey, what do you do? People are trying to make small talk. What do you do? The moment that I answer that question, if I answer it honestly, I see this look of like terror sometimes coming on people's faces. Like I travel and tell them that I speak in churches. I'm like a pastor, and I pastor other pastors and church leaders, and they begin, I can see it. They begin to kind of scan the conversation we've had so far, trying to figure out, did I say anything that perhaps I shouldn't have said? But this question, what do you do? This question, I think, highlights for us something incredibly important that I want us to kind of chat about this morning over the next few minutes. It's this thing right here. We live in an incredibly externally focused culture today. We live in an incredibly externally focused culture and society. People are always thinking about what you do, or maybe they ask what you have, or they're thinking about what they have, and they're oftentimes thinking about what other people think or say about them. And here's the crazy thing. I actually find myself kind of adapting or falling into the trap of being in this kind of externally focused culture quite a bit. In fact, I'm oftentimes aware of what other people think or say about me. So I end up, here's the kind of formula that I've found that I sometimes fall into the trap of doing, and I've seen other people do it as well. We end up doing more so that hopefully we can have more, so that people might think or even say things more about us. And this is where it gets really crazy. This is like kind of like group therapy this morning. It's not even 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and I'm just sharing. Here's what I tend to end up doing. I end up doing more so that I might have more, so that even people I don't know, or worse yet, people I don't even like, might think more of me and maybe even say more about me. Isn't that crazy? We end up doing more so we can have more, so that people maybe we don't even know, or perhaps even people we don't even like, might think more of us and perhaps say more about us. Now, here's where it gets really nuts. And I want to just say, if you're brand new to the whole church thing, maybe this is your first time in church ever, or perhaps it's your first time in church in a very long time, I want to just kind of give you an out for a couple of minutes, all right? You can kind of tune out of the conversation. Maybe you're watching online. You can kind of tune out. And I want to just have kind of a real conversation with all the church people today, just for a moment, because here's what we oftentimes do. This has been my experience anyway, is sometimes we take this formula of doing more so we can have more, so that people might think more of us and say more about us, and we actually religiously complicate this whole formula. I would never get up on a stage and say, hey, this is how to have a great relationship with God. I would never get up and say, this is how to do it. But sometimes I find myself living a life where I think that if I do more for God, then perhaps I'll have maybe a better relationship with Him. And perhaps maybe even God might think more of me, maybe even say more about me. Now, we would never say that this is how it works, this is how your relationship with God works. We would never get up, I guarantee you, Gary would never come up here and say, hey, this is how a relationship with God works. But the truth is, I've found in conversations with many people that have been following Jesus for a very long period of time that I'm not alone in this kind of story. That I'm not unique. That so many people, they fall into this trap because of this externally focused culture that we live in, that if I do more for God, I might end up having a better relationship with God, and somehow God might think more of me. Perhaps He might even say more about me. It's an incredibly challenging kind of formula. In fact, I've found it to be a formula that, quite frankly, if you don't keep it in check, if you don't find a solution to it, it's something that could quite literally ruin your soul. Here's the problem, though, is the formula, it actually works sometimes in certain cultures, in certain settings. In my story, it worked for a period of time. In fact, the more that I did for God as a young adult, the more opportunities that I had to do more for God. People would take notice of me doing things for God, and all of a sudden, I would have more opportunities come my way to do more for God. So much so that my wife and I, we started off in Christian camp and conference ministry, and we were doing a lot for God at that season. And all of a sudden, the kind of the headquarters of this global Christian camping conference ministry in New York reached out to us and recruited us to come and lead one of their primary camps and conference centers in New York. Because we were doing so much for God here in Australia, people took notice of it, and all of a sudden we had more opportunities to do more for God. I was the youngest, this is crazy, I was the youngest ever camp director for this Christian Camp and Conference Center ministry, which is in like 85 countries around the world. I was their youngest ever camp director in New York for them. Because I'm telling you, the formula in the church world especially, it tends to work. If you do more for God, little secret for you, Pastor Gary, he might actually come and invite you to do more for God. If you're doing a lot for God, all of a sudden you have more opportunities to do it for him. That led me not only to leading that camp and conference ministry and growing it and kind of scaling it to a larger size. Eventually, my wife and I got recruited by a church in Colorado Springs to come and be the lead pastor of their church. And I remember the elder team, the kind of the leadership team of the church, meeting with us, and we were doing an interview, and they were saying, you know, the guy that started our church, this is kind of horrible looking back on this now, the guy that started our church, he did a really great job. But over the last couple of years, our church has kind of plateaued in growth. The size of the church has kind of just flattened out over the last 2 or 3 years. And we're looking for somebody that could come and grow the church again and start seeing more and more people coming to the church. And at that time, I was a growth junkie. In fact, I was growing a business at the time in Austin, Texas, and working at our church on the side. And I remember saying to the elders, because they were like, we're really looking for someone that can grow this thing. And they said, and you seem to be able to grow things. And I remember saying to the team that were interviewing us at the time, I remember saying to them, I love growth so much, I even love watching my grass grow. What a stupid thing to say. Looking back, I think to myself, that team of leaders should have said, this is not the right guy for this job. But the truth is, for a period of time, doing more for God will lead you to have more opportunities to do more for him. And it may lure you into thinking that somehow, some way, God thinks more of you and maybe says more about you, and you can have a better relationship with him by doing more for him. That church in Colorado Springs, by the way, we got there. Within the first 12 to 18 months of working at the church, everything was going great guns. After 2 or 3 years of the church kind of plateauing, all of a sudden, the number of people attending on a regular weekend had grown by over 100%. It had doubled in about 18 months. And so we were adding multiple services. We had these things called connect groups or community groups. You might have small groups in your service, in your church here as well. And our community groups, our connect groups, had more than tripled. Giving, financial giving at the church had more than doubled in that period of time. Everything on the outside looked like it was going up and to the right. But what people didn't know that was internal, what was going on internally for me, is that although everything on the outside looked great, internally, things were absolutely falling apart for me. See, most of my life in leadership, I had been focused on external things. But there was a moment in that time when my wife and I was so frustrated. My wife said, hey, let's go for a walk together. There was a moment during that season when we walked around our neighborhood. And I remember coming back to the front of our home, to our driveway, and saying to Kristen, if this is how ministry is going to be, if this is what following God looks like, then I don't want to be a part of it anymore. In fact, I was so angry. I remember taking off my glasses. I actually snapped them in half and threw them on the ground. Kristen looked at me in that moment and she said to me these simple words, so powerful. She said, "You need help." And then she followed it up with this. She said, "And I can't help you." So I reached out to a couple of friends of mine, and one of them introduced me to a guy named Lance Witt. Lance Witt has become an incredible mentor and a friend over the last probably decade now. And Lance introduced me to this idea of soul care. Soul care. And Lance's definition of soul care is simply this. He calls it tending to the garden of your inner life. That's what he refers to soul care as. See, most of my life and leadership up until that point in time, I would describe it as this. It was being equipped, being kind of mentored, being taught how to harvest the forest of my external life. I was really good at growing things. I was good at recruiting people. I was good at things like public speaking. I was good at maybe building an organization or a business, all very external things. Most of my life and leadership had been focused on harvesting the forest of my external life. I'd never really known or been taught what does it look like to tend to the garden of your inner life. But here's what I discovered during that season. I discovered this, that the health of your internal life will eventually be revealed in your external life. It may not be overnight. It might take years. It could even take decades. But I eventually learned this simple truth that the health of your internal life will eventually be revealed in your external life. And here's the sad thing about this. Most of the time, what comes out is probably going to hurt those you love the most the worst. Those you love the most tend to get the worst from you when you don't pay attention to what's going on in your inner life. Up until that point in time, I really hadn't paid much attention to what was going on internally for me. In fact, I want to share with you Perko's top 5 unhealthy leadership habits that I had fallen into the trap of. Here they are. I would avoid pain and tension by staying busy for God. So there would be pain maybe on our church staff or in our family, or maybe it was with people I was working with in the business that I was involved in. And I would avoid pain and tension in the workplace, oftentimes even in the family, by just staying busy for God. In fact, I think I probably, as the lead pastor of that church, started many initiatives and things in our church simply just to avoid pain in my life. Let's just start something new. How about we adjust this thing? How about we tweak this thing? Because I was just avoiding the pain that was going on in my life. I was really ignorant of most of the feelings and emotions that were going on inside of me. I remember the first time sitting down with a counselor in 2016, and he asked me, "Jason, why are you here?" I said, "Well, I find myself frustrated all the time." And he's like, "Well, what are you frustrated about?" And I told him what I was frustrated about. He's like, "Well, is there anything more that maybe you're feeling there?" I was like, "Well, I'm feeling like I'm frustrated, and I feel angry as well." I had about 3 emotions I could articulate. I was angry, frustrated, or good. That was about it. And then he introduced me to this concept of a feelings wheel or an emotions wheel. And all of the sudden, for the first time in my life, I looked on that wheel. I'd never articulated this before. And I said to him, "You know, I'm not just frustrated. I'm not just angry. I'm actually feeling betrayed." I'd never heard myself say that. I'd never thought that before because I had been ignorant to most of what was happening inside of my life up until that point. Not only that, I was living and leading with absolutely no limits. I would say yes to just about any opportunity that came my way. I thought every opportunity was an invitation from God for me. But the truth is, I wasn't really learning how to discern what is it that God's inviting me to do. I was doing a lot for God, but I wasn't actually being with him very much. There was a lot of doing, but not much being. And then this last one I stole from my wife. I was ignorant of Fooey. Fooey is something that my wife talks about quite often. She says, Jason, sometimes we'll have a conversation, or maybe we'll go out to lunch with someone, and you know how couples, you get back in the car and you kind of debrief the conversation and so on. She'll say to me, I think there was a lot of phooey in that conversation. She would say that family of origin impacts everything. And I had not really explored my family of origin to learn how it had shaped and formed who I had become. This season of my life was so incredibly helpful for me. And I don't know what you're resonating with this morning, or maybe something that's connecting with you or not. Maybe there's something on my unhealthy leadership practices that you're like, oh, maybe I need to explore what a feelings wheel or an emotions wheel is. Like, maybe there's something that God is doing inside of me that I'm just not aware of most of the time. But during this season, there was a story that we read just a moment ago that was so powerful for me. And I know some of you may be wondering at this point, you might be thinking, is this just kind of a motivational speech, or is there a Bible part in all of this? Is there a Jesus part? This is the moment, by the way. If you're wondering that, lean in. This is the Jesus part, okay? We read this story a moment ago, a very famous story of Mary and Martha. And the problem with stories that are so famous, I find, is that familiarity with a story, you know the old adage, familiarity breeds contempt. We just kind of gloss over the story. We just fly through it because we've heard it before. Oh yeah, Mary, Martha, yeah, I remember the story. But as I read the story to you today, I want us to just slow down, and I want you to imagine yourself in the story. Perhaps even imagine that you're one of these two people in the story, or maybe you're one of the disciples in the story. And imagine what's happening in that room. And I want you to use kind of your five senses, if you would, as you're imagining. Imagine what the smells might have been in the room. Imagine what you might have been feeling, like sitting on a hard floor or maybe running around. What would have been happening inside of you? Imagine the noises going on in the room. I want you to really immerse yourself in the story, and perhaps even try to imagine, what would you be feeling if you were a part of this story that we're going to read together. I love the detail that Luke gives us. Luke gives us incredible detail. In Luke chapter 10, it starts in this way. It says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. Now, this is very common. If a rabbi was traveling, if a teacher was traveling from village to village, people would oftentimes open their homes to them, and they would invite them to come, not just to stay, but to really kind of make the home their home, kind of mikasa, sukasa kind of thing, like this place is yours, had fridge rights, like all the disciples could have just gone to the fridge and grabbed anything they needed, that kind of thing. That's kind of the setting that we're in. And then Luke goes on to tell us this. He says, she had a sister called Mary. Then I want you to notice the detail that Luke gives us in the story. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. Notice the detail. Luke doesn't just tell us that Martha had a sister named Mary, but he says, look at what Mary was doing. Mary's sitting down at the feet of Jesus. And if you knew anything about kind of first century history and kind of rabbis and teachers in those days, where you would want to be seated would have been on the right or the left-hand side of the rabbi. That would have been a place of prominence. For all you social media people, this is where you maybe somebody snap a picture of Jesus and they tag at Jesus Rabbi, and you'd be seen on the left or right-hand side. Like, oh, wow, reshare that. Let everyone know I was in the room. Not Mary. Not worried about her place of position or prominence. Notice Luke says she's sitting, and what is she doing? She's just listening. Can I ask you a question? How often do you just sit at Jesus' feet and listen? Without a list of things you need him to do, although very important. Many prayer meetings happening this week, and we're going to be praying for a lot of things, very important. But how often do you just sit at Jesus' feet in silence to just listen? Incredible what Mary's doing. What an example to us to just sit and listen to our Rabbi Jesus. The story continues, goes on to say, but Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. And it's easy for us in this story, when we read it, it's easy. Come on, it's easy for us to go, oh, look at Martha, what was she doing? But the truth is, when I put myself in Martha's shoes, and I kind of rephrase this, I think to myself, but Jason was distracted by all of the small groups that needed to be launched. Jason was distracted by all of the people that needed to start coming to the church and started giving financially. Jason was distracted by the children's ministry space that we needed to build. Fill in the blank, but Martha was distracted by all the things that had to be done. Not only was she distracted, the story goes on to tell us, Luke continues to tell us, he says, Martha came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? And then Martha, I got to tell you, I got a lot of respect for Martha. She doubles down. She's not only like, hey, don't you care? She's got a lot of, I think they call it chutzpah. Tell her to help me. She's demanding of the rabbi, tell her to help me. And then I love the response of the rabbi, how gracious and how kind Jesus is. And listen, if you're here for the very first time in church, maybe it's not a part of your normal routine, or maybe you stumbled online and watching this and you're not sure about God and Jesus and this whole church thing, just let me tell you that the way that Jesus responds, so kind and so gracious, is the way he wants to have a relationship with you as well. This is what he says. Martha, Martha. I wonder sometimes, did Luke not put in all the Marthas, like he only put in two? I think there might have been a few more. Martha, 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 Martha. You are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed. And then Jesus actually doubles down. Indeed, only one. And he goes on to tell her, Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Don't be confused. Notice, Jesus doesn't say, this is the only thing. He says, this is what is better. What Martha is doing is important, but what Mary is doing is priority. I remember when I read this, I walked over to a whiteboard in my office at the church I was pastoring in Colorado, and I wrote these words on the whiteboard. I wrote, being with Jesus. I'm not a mathematician. I mentioned before that I'm a PE teacher by profession, but I used a mathematical equation. I put greater than doing for Jesus. Being with Jesus, Jason, is better than doing for Jesus. Some of the mathematicians in the room, you can tell me if I got the symbol the right way around or not, because I'm always confused by it. But the point is, being with Jesus is far greater than doing for him. Jesus said it this way. I love the way Jesus describes it. He says, I am the vine, you are the branches. He says, remain in me, and you'll bear much fruit. Then he goes on to say, and apart from me, you can do nothing. I think most of us in the room, most of us, we want our lives to bear much fruit. All of my doing for Jesus was actually motivated by my desire that I would bear much fruit, that my life would count for something. And Jesus says the formula to that is very simple. Not easy, but simple. If you remain in me and I remain in you, you'll bear much fruit. Jason, you want to bear much fruit? You want your life to count for something? Remain in me, and I'll remain in you. And I'll bear much fruit through you. Apart from me, you can actually do nothing. In this season of my life, there was one particular practical thing that I began doing, which has become a foundation, and I would say a game changer, to moving into a position where my being for Jesus flows out of my doing for Jesus flows out of my being with him. There was one particular practice. And I want to just invite you, if you have your phone, you can grab your phone. I want to send you something in an email. We're going to put a QR code up on the screen. It's a simple card, which is just a silence and solitude kind of card that you can print off. You can grab your phone right now, pull it out if you like, and scan the QR code. And it will walk you through what we talked about, what Mary was doing at the feet of Jesus, listening to Jesus. This simple card will just walk you through a practical application of what it looks like to just sit at the feet of Jesus and listen to him. Because my being and doing was all out of whack, this simple practice of sitting in silence and stillness to listen to Jesus has become a game changer, a foundation changer for me in my walking with Jesus. At the end of the day, here's what I believe is true. I believe Jesus would say this to us, that all of our doing for Jesus, he wants it to flow out of our being with him. Everything we're doing for him, he wants it to flow out of our simply abiding in his presence and being with him. And so I want to invite you to consider, how is your life right now? How's your being versus your doing? Are you sitting at the feet of Jesus like Mary on a regular basis, listening to what Jesus wants to say to you? And is your doing for him flowing out of your being with him? Let me pray for us. Father, thank you. Thank you for preserving this incredible story of Mary and Martha. Thank you for the image of Mary sitting at your feet, listening to her rabbi. God, I pray that we wouldn't fall into the trap of the formula of this world where we think if we do more, we'll have more. And we think that you might think more of us and say more of us because of it. God, help us to remember that our doing for you must flow out of our being with you. I pray this in Jesus' precious name. Amen.